All right. Welcome, everyone. And welcome back for most of you. We're going to get started on day 2 of the Future of Social Democracy conference here at Remark. I'm Stefanos Geroulanos. I will not be involved until the last panel. Alex Zevin is our chair for the first panel today. Alex.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for being here on a Saturday morning. My name is Alexander Zevin. I'm a professor of history, of European history at the City University of New York. And it's my pleasure to introduce this panel of speakers. First, we have Isabella Weber, professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and the author of How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. And she has recently been at the forefront of a public debate over the origins and persistence of inflation and what to do about it in the OECD countries. And I think maybe we'll have occasion to talk about that. Next is Branko Milanovic, professor at the Graduate Center at CUNY and a former lead economist at the World Bank, where he became a leading expert on the growth and underlying causes of inequality. His latest book, Visions of Inequality, lays out a history of the concept of inequality from the physiocrats to the end of the Cold War, with discussion of the present as well. And finally, we have Paul Magnette, a professor of political theory at the Free University of Brussels and the president of the Belgian Socialist Party, also mayor of Charleroi. And he is the author of numerous books, his latest being La Vie Large, Manifeste Ecosocialist, an Ecosocialist manifesto that came out in 2022. So with that, I am handing it over to Isabella.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. Well, I would say congratulations to all of us for being here on a Saturday morning to talk about the future of social democracy. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure. The title of my presentation is Inflation and Economic Disaster Preparedness in Times of Overlapping Emergencies Towards a New Stabilization Paradigm. So I think when we talk about the future, we like to talk about the new stuff, the exciting stuff, the utopian stuff, the great visions for wonderful blooming landscapes. And stabilization paradigms tend to be less exciting when we talk about great visions for future societies. So I'm taking kind of a different approach here by arguing that if we don't have an alternative stabilization paradigm, whatever blooming landscapes we might think of, whatever blooming landscapes we might even be able to create, are always at the risk of being demolished by destabilization. And if we don't have an answer to how we react to economic shocks, then at the end of the day, this probably means austerity. So if we don't have an alternative playbook for economic stabilization, the looming danger of austerity will always be there. It's of course always there, but if we don't have an alternative, we will be completely defenseless in the face of economic instabilities. When I'm talking about overlapping emergencies, what I'm thinking of is the overlapping emergencies of climate change and extreme weather events, which of course is already a reality in the so-called global age of boiling. I'm also thinking about a global political order that I consider as unstable as it hadn't been in many decades, which has huge implications for economic stability. And I'm also thinking of the pandemic, which I think, given that many epidemiologists had been warning of something like this might happen, didn't come out of nowhere, but tells us something about the relationship between human and nature that is apparently in a state of emergency that has created a global pandemic so severe that that large chunks of the world economy had to be shut down temporarily. So while there is a great urge, especially in economics, to kind of think about this moment as a moment where we are just about to go back to more stable, more normal times, there is an urge to think we are at the cusp of a return to some sort of a great moderation. And then there's a kind of talk about polycrisis as like these like big tendencies that are happening. When I'm talking about overlapping emergencies, I'm thinking of this in like kind of one level more concrete than the polycrisis, in the sense of there will be actual emergencies happening, there will be shocks, We know that there will be shocks. We do not know where they're going to hit. We do not know when they're going to hit. We might also not know how they're going to hit. And we have informed guesses, but we can be fairly sure that there will be more shocks to come. Okay, in the Great Moderation, I think that the stabilization paradigm had been a little bit akin to this coin-pawed horse. So depending on where you grew up, when you might have grown up, this might be a childhood memory or not. For me, this like immediately makes me think of waiting in front of a grocery store and sitting on it, and it's kind of entertaining but also boring, and it makes a horrible sound. But in any case, this is not the point. The point is that this is a mechanical tool that moves in a one-dimensional kind of fashion. We know exactly what the mechanism is that makes it move forward or makes it move backward. It's completely predictable. We know exactly what we need to do to make it move forward more, move forward less. So we are in completely safe territory. I would argue that there had been like kind of a good and a bad type of stabilization paradigm that more or less followed that kind of logic. The good from, I mean, if we care about social democracy, I would say like kind of a Keynesian counter-cyclical idea where you think that you can keep the range of motion of the macroeconomic development, or in other words, the business cycle, within a certain bandwidth by doing counter-cyclical macroeconomic policies. And from a social democratic perspective, I would argue the bad brother of this, the kind of monetarist vision of more or less pro-cyclical policy, where whenever you get so-called overheating, you get austerity, and whenever you get inflation, you get interest rate hikes and so on. But the commonality is that it's a one-dimensional macro to macro kind of analysis. You manipulate something on the macro level, and that is sufficient to stabilize the macro level. So you don't have to care about what is happening on the micro meso level. You don't have to look under the hood. Now, what I have been arguing for a while now is that we have to think about stabilization policy in the age of overlapping emergencies more like riding an actual horse. So anyone who ever went on a trail ride probably was prompted by whoever instructed you that there are certain things you're supposed to pay attention to. So for example, when you encounter a person on a bike, you want to talk to this person so that the horse recognizes this person as a human being and doesn't take the bike for a, I don't know, a magically powered steel monster and spooks. You are always in uncertain territory because your vision is completely different from the vision of the horse. So you're never going to have like perfect foresight, but you can make an assessment of the typical triggers, the typical things that can set off your horse, that can create very major instability. And this instability is actually not at all one-dimensional, but it can go in all sorts of directions, triggered by very, very small things that sometimes are even invisible from the vision of the rider. Okay, if we take this metaphorical approach to economics and to economic modeling, what we have done together with co-authors is to use input-output modeling to try to understand what are the potential sector-level trigger points that can unleash macro-level instability, and we have focused on inflation. Now, one of the first applications of input-output methods was strategic bombing during the Second World War. Then the question was basically, what are the points of the enemy's economy that if you're going to hit, will create the largest possible destruction to the enemy's economy? So we are turning this around, the same logic, and say, what are the largest, the most severe points of vulnerability, but using ultimately the same kind of modeling technique. However, we focus on prices instead of quantities. So we look at what are the prices that when they get unhinged, have the potential to unsettle the whole price system and create overall inflation. Now, I'm not gonna bore you with any equations. I'm gonna jump straight to the results. And this chart is designed for you not to be able to read it, courtesy of your presenter, because I want you to focus on the distribution of these bars first. So each of these bars represents a total inflation impact that comes from a shock to one individual sector. So we have 71 sectors. Each bar represents a sector. Total length represents total inflation impact. The yellow part represents the direct inflation impact in the sense of the change in the consumption prices in the consumption basket that resides from this specific price change. And the purple part is the indirect effect that we get from our input-output modeling. Now, on the first chart to the left, we use the price volatilities before the pandemic. So kind of the normal tendency of prices to move. And this is the distribution we get. The second chart is for price movements in the annual price movements in the fourth quarter of 2021. So right at the onset of the post-shutdown inflation. And the third chart is the second quarter of 2022, which is just when the Ukraine war started. All of this is for the United States. So what stands out for me is that the distribution of these bars is very, very similar. So what we can say is that some prices matter much more than others for inflation. And there's nothing in our model that would determine this. If we zoom in and we look at what we are calling the latent systemically significant prices, which we get from these normal price movements by sectors, we find that there are 8 sectors that are latently significant and that occur again and again and again, independent of what kind of constellations we choose for our simulations. And these sectors are petroleum and coal products, oil and gas extraction, farms, food and beverage and tobacco products, chemical products, housing, utilities, and wholesale trade. If we think about what kind of sectors those are, I think we can say these are basic necessities, food, housing, utilities. These are basic production inputs, all the energy stuff and chemicals, and the basic infrastructure of circulation, wholesale trade, and sometimes some transportation sectors also show up, depending on the constellation that we use. You might have noticed that I skipped Federal Reserve banks, the reason being that I don't think that Federal Reserve banks are particularly well represented in an input-output network. And I also think that we don't need to discuss that the interest rate is a systemically important price. In fact, I would argue that the coin-powered horse vision of stabilization is that there's exactly one systemically important price, which is the price of money, which is the interest rate. Okay, when we do these other simulations for the actual onset of the inflation, we find that the latent systemically significant prices by and large are also the realized ones. So in other words, from the vantage points of this analysis, we could have known what the critical sectors would have been. Not perfectly, there are some that show up that we would not have anticipated, but by and large, we would have anticipated them. Okay, if you have such shocks to systemically significant sectors, then there's, of course, a question of how the transmission happens, right? In the input-output model, we just make assumptions on how the transmission happens. In a separate paper titled Sellers, Inflation, Profit, and Conflict, we have looked quite extensively at earnings calls of firms and firm-level examples to try to understand how firms actually react to large price shocks in the context of the pandemic and the war. And what we find is that, by and large, the industries that are using these inputs in which prices and profits exploded are in a strong position to protect their profit margins. Now, if an industry protects its profit margins in response to a cost shock, this actually amounts to an increase in profits. One way of thinking about this in very simple terms is if you go buy a house and you have to pay a brokerage fee, if the cost of your house goes up, the brokerage fee goes up. It's the exact same phenomenon, just of course in a different accounting setting, but it's the same situation, right? So if the overall cost goes up and the brokerage fee stays constant, or in this case, the profit margin stays constant, and profits go up. Some firms have also been able to actually increase their profit margins, in particular in the upstream commodity type sectors where firms are not price makers, but are actually price takers, where you have seen a coincidence of price and profit explosions, which happens to be in these systemically important sectors. Okay, so we have huge increases in profits in stuff like oil and gas and so on. We then have the corporate sector, by and large, being in a position to protect its margins against these shocks and thereby increasing its profit volumes. So from that perspective, we have an unequalizing effect of inflation. We also have a situation where if the prices of essential consumer goods, so if we now focus on the direct effect from the charts that I showed to you before, are large, these effects affect lower income groups disproportionately. Simply put, if you are poor, you're basically spending all your money on shelter, food, and energy, and maybe some transportation, which are exactly the systemically important sectors. And we actually have a separate paper that is work in progress where we can show empirically that these shocks have an unequalizing effect. Okay, so, sorry, this was meant to, okay. So, if we take this together, we have two dimensions through which we have an unequalizing inflation that comes from these shocks to systemically important sectors. When the inflation first started, there was a big debate over whether we should care about inflation or not. And some people on the progressive side were saying, like, inflation is transitory. I happen to agree that inflation is probably transitory. But the conclusion that was often drawn from this was, because it's transitory, we don't have to worry. We are just going to lean back and wait for inflation to pass. It's a storm that comes and goes. We don't have to care. What is, I think, underpinning that idea of transitory inflation doesn't matter is some sort of an old school Phillips curve type of understanding of inflation, where inflation goes up, employment goes up, and at the end of the day, inflation is good for workers. So we shouldn't worry about inflation because, I mean, it's, if anything, it's going to make workers a little bit better off. Okay, so what? That is a good thing. And what we definitely don't want is for the central banks to step up, and we don't want austerity to kick in. So we better like kind of downplay the importance of inflation. What I think has happened with this inflation, and that's not only my opinion. I mean, I was brave enough to stick my head out early on and got a beating for it. But by now, this is the view of the OECD, this is the view of the ECB, this is the view of the IMF, that this has been an unequalizing kind of inflation in the sense that, yes, we do now get wage catch-up. So there are attempts of catch-up on the wage side, but this is an attempt to catch up, right? So we are already in the middle of inflation. Real incomes have collapsed. In the German case, for example, if you look at the time series for real wages and you go back to 1948, we have never seen anything comparable in terms of collapse of real wages for West Germany. Not if we include East Germany, but it's dramatic. It's really, really dramatic. So that's why I think we absolutely should care. We should care from the perspective of social cohesion. We should care from the perspective of inequality. We should care from the perspective of not just social democracy, but democracy itself. In Germany right now, the very right-wing Alternative for Germany is in the second place in the polls. Okay, sorry, I'm going to show you the charts later. I have changed my strategy, but I think you can still follow. So if we react now to this kind of inflation with austerity, we are, of course, going to make matters worse from a distributional perspective, because we know that austerity is meant to function by pushing down wages. It's meant to increase unemployment. So at the end of the day, what austerity is trying to do in this setting, and again, this is by now very explicit in the studies of, for example, the IMF, is basically to prevent a wage price spiral. However, the wage price spiral in this setup is an outcome of this unequalizing inflation. It's not like wages started off inflation, but it's that eventually you get a wage catch-up that then has the potential to trigger a wage price spiral. And I think there is a potential. I think it's not automatic. I don't think it's mechanic. It depends on how firms will react to wage increases, whether they will be willing to absorb the wage increases, or whether the wage increases will constitute a new kind of shock, basically another shock to a systemically significant sector, because we can all agree that wages are an absolutely systemically significant price. Okay, if you now go into this and you react with austerity, you basically make the situation worse in the sense that the distribution outcomes will be even worse. Okay, so we probably care about this from a normative point of view. We probably care about this from an economic stability point of view, because it also, of course, accelerates a recession. And we care about this, I guess, from a political stability point of view. Okay, but let's be completely cynical. Let's say we don't care about any of this, okay? We don't care. But we are living in a time of overlapping emergencies. Now, we have had the mega shock of the pandemic. We have had the mega shock of war in Europe. We are in a situation where the US-China relations are at rock bottom. The climate change is a reality. So it's quite likely that there will be more shocks to come. Suppose you are already in the middle of a recession. you still have inflationary tendencies. Your interest rates are already at, I don't know, 7%. And then you get another mega shock. What are you going to do? I mean, are you just going to keep hiking interest rates? Are you just going to keep imposing austerity? Maybe that's a recipe. It's clearly a recipe for disaster. But I think even from a purely technical, technocratic, economic management point of view, it would be a totally ineffective kind of way of dealing with this situation. So what I'm arguing in my work is that instead we need some sort of a toolbox approach for economic disaster preparedness. And I'm quite consciously saying here some possible ingredients, because a new economic stabilization paradigm is not going to pull it out of my head overnight. I think this is like a huge project. So basically, I think what we need to do is to create mechanisms that prevent these shocks from creating all these knock-on effects that I have tried to illustrate. So first of all, of course, we want to do the structural stuff. We want to tackle the sources of the emergencies. We want to enhance the resilience of these sectors, of course. Like this is kind of the structural long-run stuff. But all of that takes time, right? And this is a kind of a long-run project. In the short run, I think what we need is, first of all, a recognition that these systemically important sectors are systemically important and have the potential to create all these gigantic knock-on effects. So we need monitoring. For example, if you look at the gas prices, in fall, winter 2021, it was already crystal clear that we were walking into a gas price crisis in Germany. And this is before the war. But there was just no awareness because no one paid attention to it and no one saw this as something systemically important. So I think like even recognizing that and having monitoring capacity is an important step in the right direction. But of course, we also need local shock absorbers, which, if possible, can absorb the shocks by mobilizing redundancies that prevent supply shortfalls from having immediate price implications. What I have in mind here is, for example, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the United States. But of course, these kind of shock absorbers have to be sectorally specific. What we would do for food is not the same as what we would do for oil. What we might do for housing is not the same as what we would do for chemicals. So this requires an awful lot of sectoral expertise to come up with effective strategies. And finally, I think we might have to kind of reclaim the essential. We might have to reclaim, I mean, this is now going more in the direction of long-run visions, reclaim the systemically important parts. After all, central banks, which today are charged with managing the one and only systemically important price, were once private. They eventually were recognized as being too important to be left purely to the private sector. So I think a similar kind of thinking is necessary. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. That was wonderful, Isabella. Could we now hear from Branko?
Okay, well, this is a little bit different. Of course, many people know that I work on global income distribution. This is a really tiny part of this global income distribution. I'm currently, of course, I've got a bunch of papers. The current one that I'm doing, it's almost finished. It's an 80-page paper of 200 years of global income distribution. It does build, of course, some work of François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson, but then revises the GDP per capita historical, because now we have better data from Edison, and then goes into the most recent period. So I will not talk about the history, which actually I think quite interesting, because in this data you see actually the European and North American takeoff, because that creates inequality. Inequality in the 19th century is the result, and I have to explain why I'm just very briefly saying that, is the result of the American and North European development, which created large gaps, the so-called Great Divergence with Asia. At the same time, inequalities in all of these, advancing countries was going up as well within countries. So in those days, you had two forces which are pushing global inequality up, increasing gaps between the nations and increasing gaps between classes or individuals within nations. Then you come to the basically latter part of the, after the World War II, essentially, you come to a very interesting situation of extremely high global inequality, shrinking domestic gaps, for the reasons that we all know, the Great Compression, FDR, National Health Service, Labour Party, communist revolutions, French compression. But the overall inequality is extremely high, and that's the world into which, for example, I was born, and I thought when I was born, well, not exactly when I was born, but maybe a couple of years later, that it was a normal world. It's a tripartite world of the capitalist first world that, richer and more unequal than the second world, which was poor and more equal, and the third world, which was basically kind of a residual world of countries that then became independent and with fairly high inequality and low incomes. Well, that world has really come to an end in the latter part of the 20th century, turn of the century, with the rise of China and Asia. And so I'll stop that very small kind of excursus to history to tell you then that new world is the mirror image, but like every mirror image is the opposite of the first world. Because what Asia is doing is actually, if I can now go to the next slide, which it seems to be a challenge. Here it is. What Asia is doing is essentially redoing the Great Convergence. But what happens is now the global inequality is going down because the countries, particularly China, it's not only China, but largely China, started very poor and then grew extremely fast. I actually mentioned that, if you want to kind of paraphrase Churchill, never in history have so many people grown so much over such a long time. This is the result of China of 40 years. So it actually reduced global inequality because of the forces of reduction in population-weighted international inequality. There was increase in inequality in each individual country, but these forces are small. So I really want to make one statement very, very clear. In PPP terms, global inequality has been on the decline for the last 20, 25 years. This is also true if you use exchange rate. That actually, even with the exchange rates where it's actually much higher, it has been on a decline. But it has been extremely high. It used to be Gini of 70, now it is Gini of 60. Gini of 60, as you know, is hardly found in any country. So the global inequality, obviously, is greater than, it's like basically like South African inequality, if you want to have a sort of an idea. But in exchange rates, it's even higher than that. So one has to keep two things separate. The level is very high. The direction of change is the decline. I'm sometimes annoyed actually by us being only the Delta society. If you say something bad has been going down, and they say, okay, that's fine, there are no problems. But you know what? That bad can be very, very bad. So it's getting little bit better. Doesn't mean that the problem is solved. So you have to take the level into account. Now, this is a simple illustration of the rise of Asia. The one shows you China's total GDP in PPP terms. And the other one, this is quite well known. China overtook the US in 2015, but I actually like Germany, India, because it's much less well known. And you see a really total flip in the relative positions. So now, why am I mentioning this, and why you say, why does it really care for social democracy in Europe that China is doing well? Well, that's great, let's have India do well, and Indonesia do well, and Thailand, and Vietnam. Well, one thing that I really want to focus there is the following thing. It has had dramatic impacts on Europe, and I'll show you that in a minute. First, global income distribution has changed. Notice that 1988, it was really shifted very much on the left because that's where most Asians were. Very low incomes. We're talking there in PPP terms like $400. One of my students recently, when I showed that in my class, she was very timid, at the end of the class, she said, but what are the time periods for these things? I said, well, it's annual. That's $1 per day. Because people were saying, like, is it month or maybe like, an hourly wage? Just to illustrate you the huge difference between incomes in the world. Now it has really changed. This is a log normal scale. You can see actually the green line, which looks like normal, but in log terms. And it looks like almost a function of an individual country. Major change. Look at the thickness in the middle. And basically all of that comes, not basically, it all comes from Asia. and largely by China, but also by a few others. Now, this is, how do I go always? Okay, this is, I have to mention, however, that if you exclude China and take periphery, everybody else is periphery, and the core is the usual core, all the OECD, including Japan, Western Europe, and so on, the ratio of the medians is 8.5. So a median income person in the West is 8 times richer in PPP terms than a median person in the periphery. In the exchange rate terms, 22 times. So we have to realize that actually the overlaps between what the so-called periphery and the core, excluding China, are fairly minimal. We are talking about only 1% of the West, called Westerners, being poorer than the median of the periphery, and approximately 1 or 2% of the peripheral nation people. These are not nations, these are individuals, being richer than the median in the West. Finally, one point which I always like to mention, because people talk about 1% and say, oh, this is really horrible, and who are these 1%ers? 12% of Americans, and probably half of the people sitting here, are, maybe all actually, are the global top 1%. The median Western income is at the 95th percentile. So we're talking about the fact that people in the West are actually all in the top 20%. Now, that is going to change, and it is changing, and that's what is my next message. I will skip the elephant chart because you all know it, and it has been really discussed. It basically shows that the point A, the growth of Asian incomes, they were like around the middle. Point B is really absence of growth of richer people, but these are like lower classes of the European countries that are about 80th percentile. Point C is the top 1%. It actually became popular because it very clearly shows you the political dilemma. So what do you do? If you're like in a Western country and you see this graph, you say, okay, what do I do? Do I actually now go and screw Chinese and say, okay, forget about your globalization? That's exactly what the US is doing now. We'll squeeze you out. We'll actually make sure that you don't grow. We will not give you technology. We will change the rule. We will say that you're stealing everything from us. And we're actually going to push A down, and we are going to hope to bring jobs here and push B back. Or you can say differently. You can say, okay, I don't care really, let China grow, that's fine. But I have this point C, which are my domestic top 1%. So I'm going to impose taxes. I'm going to actually do inheritance taxes. I'm going to take money from them, and I'm going to give it to the number B, and I'm going to have free education. And, not expensive education, $100,000 a year. So these are two alternatives. I mean, I'm not going to speak like who did what alternative, but that's the situation. Then a situation continued in the next, these are of course the 3 points. It continued in the next 10 years with one change, is that the very top of the global income distribution, essentially because the very top of the income distribution in the US did not fully recover from the crisis. So that top of the global income distribution did not grow in the second period, which is red here, as much as it did in the first period. So you don't have the elephant, you have a downward sloping line. Again, in the middle are Asian countries. The bottom is very complicated because there, I will skip that because it would take me under 10 minutes to explain. It's pretty complicated, but it's also driven by China evacuating the very bottom of that global income distribution. And so now I come to the greatest reshuffle, and I'm not exaggerating, greatest reshuffle of global income position since the Industrial Revolution. It's actually what is happening is the rich countries, lower parts of rich countries' income distribution, meaning middle class or the lower middle class, are in the range in which Asian incomes, and particularly Chinese incomes, are coming and have already come. And what I want to say is the following. If you're like, suppose, a worker in Italy, and I'll show you Italy in a second, and you are like, doing okay in Italy, lower part of the income distribution, but you're, okay, maybe I'll also show you, you are there here at 1988 at the blue line, and the vertical axis is your position in the global income distribution, and the horizontal, your axis in Italian income distribution. So you're some worker in Italy, maybe southern Italy, you're not really doing very well and so on, but you're still at the 78th percentile of the global income distribution. That would be the second Italian this side, okay? what happens to you? It does not necessarily that, well, we know first Italy has not grown in 25 years, which is an interesting fact to it by itself, which many people don't know. They go to Italy, it's a beautiful country. I say, actually, you can argue that nobody in history of the world has had such good lives like Italians now. But I think it's a reasonable assumption, but it's a country which is in total decline. So, you know, you have again to distinguish things. So, okay, you go there, it's beautiful, excellent. Now, what happened in the meantime is that, look at the China. This is the urban China. In 1988, the urban China, which is 800 million people, spanned the range from being very poor at the bottom. These are people at the 15th global percentile, if you look at them, you know, there. And the richest urban Chinese were a little bit below the 70s. So it's a no-brainer. They all went up because the average growth rate was almost 10%. So then they spanned the range from 35th to the 96th percentile. Okay, we all applaud that this is great. But as I said, they are positional changes. So when these Chinese go up, they change their position in global income distribution. They move from the median to the 60th to the 70th percentile and so on. So then they come to our Italian worker who was at the 72nd percentile. And 5 million of them come because these are actually data by percentile. And they say, no, you are doing really good. Your real salary is okay. But you're no longer 72nd percentile. You will become now, I don't know, he went, I'm sorry, actually, he used to be at 77, then he became 72. And the very bottom, of course, went 15. Because the more in the bottom you are, closer you are to this large movement shift of the population. China effect, of course, is the strongest, but you know, you have others coming in. Indonesia, Vietnam, these are large countries, India, obviously. They have not yet generated the middle class that China has, but they will generate it in 10 years to 12 years, and so on. And then it was interesting, Germany, the same story as Italy, but less dramatic. But for all Western countries that I've done, US, maybe I have it also, the bottom has gone down. Up is like about the same, and the very top is unaffected. And that's a beautiful part. How beautiful part is Brazil. The bottom in Brazil, totally unaffected. They were the poorest in the world before, and they're the poorest in the world now. They are at the bottom percentiles, 0. The top, totally unaffected. They were the global top 1% or global 5%. They are fine, unaffected. The middle gets affected. So in Brazil, it's the middle that gets affected. In Western Europe and the US, it's the bottom. Now, interesting part, I just showed that in Poland. They just hit the roof when I did that. I said to you, you know, you guys have been more successful European country over the last 30 years in terms of growth. The only country which didn't have a negative growth. Okay, everybody is happy, such a great country. Then I say, but look, in 1980, when you had Garrick and demonstrations and stuff, your workers were globally placed above their position today. Why is that? Because, of course, all the Asians were below them. But now these Asians, whom you can see here, they are no longer below them. They're actually above them. So the Polish bottom part of the income distribution also went down. It's striking, but the point is, if you grow by 5%, which is a lot, well, it's still half of 10%. So somebody who has been below you would eventually catch up with you and overtake. So this is the change which has happened in relative income positions, excuse me, over the last 30 years. And I think it's a major change because it has never happened before. Because since we have the data from 1820, the top of the global income position was really basically occupied, controlled by Europeans, generally West Europeans, North Americans, Japan later, but not by Asians. So you would have like some 1 or 2 guys, but they would not come in household service, so they were not present there. It is still true that if you look, and I think I don't have this, okay, I don't have it here, but if you go study the top 5% and top 1%, the Chinese presence in the top 5% is relatively small. US has 40% share of Americans in the top 5% is 40. Britain, Germany, Japan are about between 4 and 6, And China, urban China, has now first time appeared with something like 5%. India is still 1.5%. So the very top is really still isolated, but the rest is not. So what I want to say, and that's what I want to conclude, is that basically you have a major reshuffle, which might not be felt by individual as it happens, because we don't know what are our positions, but certainly certain goods, particularly the goods that are priced in international prices, would gradually become inaccessible to people who are not at that particular position globally to afford such goods. And then secondly, I think it's a particular question for Europe. I think the situation, in my opinion, is pretty bleak. Europe has not been growing. It's a sluggish continent. It is a continent that now, particularly with the Russian war, has got cut off from its natural supplier of oil and gas. And it's a continent which is exposed to the inflow of labor, which is driven from a region, Africa, with the only increase in population in the world of about 2%, and with, that is actually most of only gaps in income, which are 10 to 1. I actually just cannot imagine that the Mediterranean Sea, which has always been a unified sea throughout the whole history, is now divided, and the gap between the northern shore and the southern shore, people don't think of this, but there has never been a gap of that magnitude in history. You just go read Roman history, you read Greece, you read actually the fights between the Ottomans and the Spaniards, you read the naval battles, the gap was never this large. And so to believe that the gap of 10 to 1 is going to be maintained, where cultural proximity, first, geographical proximity is there, cultural because of the language, and rising gaps is really like madness. And of course, when it comes to Africa, this is skipping about China. China no longer has an equality role to play, because it has become sufficiently rich that it is neutral now as to the global inequality, and actually even positive. The countries that are negatively affected, meaning reducing, where the growth is important, are India in particular, and African countries. Actually, large African countries, 5 or 6, starting with Nigeria, South Africa, Sudan, Congo, Ethiopia, and Egypt. But when I look at the past, when I look at African performance, it is dismal. There is only one country with a sizable number of people, which is Ethiopia, which maintained for more than 5 years, in this special case, 13 years, a rate of growth of greater than 5% per capita per annum, which you can say, well, that's really great that you need to have some convergence. So we don't have very good sort of expectations that Africa, based on the past, will do well. On top of that, the last bad news is that Africa will be, as we all know, will be particularly severely, badly affected by climate change. So really, essentially, we have all this is longer term. Isabella is really about the real present and the struggle with inflation. These are really longer term phenomena that I think are not lending much to sort of leading us much to an optimistic conclusion. I would rather say the very opposite. Despite the fact that we had a decline in equality, but I think that even decline might come to an end. And it's actually slowing down and coming to an end probably now. And we might have another increase in inequality if Africa does not converge. So on that really sort of funny note, let's stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Branko. Now we'll hear from Paul.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to Stefanos and the whole team and the organizer for this invitation. I'm very, very pleased to be here. I'm a politician today, but I was an academic in a former life, and when you can take some time, sometimes I miss my academic life, and when you can take some time to think and to listen to so brilliant presentations and to participate in discussions, it's very good in life. And thank you for giving me the chance to speak after Isabella and Branko's brilliant presentations, because what I'm trying to do when I write sometimes, and in this book, this Eco-Socialist Manifesto, is to try and draw some political conclusions of the analysis of those brilliant. I'm great reader. I can demonstrate it. I've got it.
Oh, yeah,
Branko, Piketty, and all those great economists who are a very strong inspiration for us. But I only try to be slightly less pessimistic than Branko's conclusion. I think that we politicians have this moral duty to be not optimistic, but at least voluntaristic, and to try and see where we have positive horizons and positive prospects. And I do that particularly in the correlation between this issue of inequalities, which I think is the big issue of the time, and social inequalities and inequalities of wealth, of course, but also this very and ever more important dimension of climate inequalities. When I jumped into politics 15 years ago, one of the first positions I was appointed to was a Belgian minister in charge of climate and energy, and I had a big chance to participate to many conferences at a global level, the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to see all those negotiations from inside, and to be struck by how important the issue of climate change is. And I was convinced, I'm still convinced, that this is the big issue of the time, that would be the big issue of the next 2 generations at least. And also how the liberal vision, which was so dominant, again, 15 years ago, it was a sort of the liberal dogma that liberalism would solve everything, but it's a huge failure. And so we social democrats, I think, have the responsibility to demonstrate that other options are possible, that we have better options. So the reason why I wrote this book is first that I was confined at home, like everybody with the pandemics, and I need to do something. But the second reason is that I wanted to try and show that climate change can be a big opportunity for socialism. It can be, it forces us to a huge aggiornamento of our doctrine, but also that socialism can be a big opportunity for climate change, that we have lots of, in our history, conceptually, politically, we have lots of elements that can contribute to a positive answer to the issues of climate change. And so what I will try to review here in 15 minutes is that we have the best diagnosis of the situation, that we have the best policy options, and that we have the best methods and institutional setting. But do we have the strategy? And that's, I think, the big question. It's not enough to have the best options, to be the most clever people on earth. You also have to have the strategy. That's politics. So why do we have the best diagnosis? Well, because it's all about inequalities. It's been widely demonstrated nowadays. It was not the case 15 years ago. 15 years ago, when I took part in all those conferences, everybody was talking about the Anthropocene. And the big question was, this is the responsibility of human beings. And we have to demonstrate this is the responsibility of human beings. That was important, of course, at that time, in a debate, in a confrontation with climate skeptics people. It was important to demonstrate that, yes, we human beings have caused this phenomenon of climate change. But, you know, Margaret Thatcher famously said, there is no such thing as society, or liberal conservative, but for us, social democrats, there's no such thing as human beings. I mean, of course, there are human beings, but human beings are men and women, racialized or not racialized. They are members of different social groups. And as long as you don't take the human beings in the different structures, you cannot understand the phenomenon. And by chance, we now have incredible data that demonstrate this. If you do not know it, I highly recommend the World Inequality Lab, which is a beautiful website with lots of data compiled by notably Thomas Piketty, Lucas Chancel, and others, and really in line with the kind of analysis that Branko has just made now, which demonstrate in very simple terms the perfect correlation between global inequalities within the nations, and climate inequalities. To put it in very briefly, we know that this famous one person, the one richest person of the world, is responsible today for more than 17% of greenhouse gas emission, while the 50 poorest part of the world, the poorest half of the world, is responsible for only 12% of climate of our greenhouse gas emissions today. But even without taking into consideration the fact that we, the West, are responsible for the global phenomenon, and that the rest of the world, including China, has a very limited responsibility historically. But even if we leave history aside and we look at the present situation, the one top person has an enormous responsibility in the deterioration of the situation, and it keeps growing. I mean, we haven't even stabilized the level of greenhouse gas emission, although we see the consequences. And this is not the only point. Not only are the poor people much less responsible, but they are the first victims of climate change. If you look at global level again, you look at Africa, you look at Somalia, you look at Pakistan, you look at Libya those days, floods, droughts, heat waves, all those phenomena which are the consequences of climate change are first and foremost affecting poor people everywhere in the world, and including in the rich countries. My country was confronted with enormous floods 2 years ago, which created more than 40 people died, and 3,000 people lost everything, their house, their company, and so on. You would never imagine that that would take place in Belgium, in a rich country today, but people start understanding that, yes, it takes place here too. And all those people who lost everything were the people living in the valley, and historically the people living in the valley along the river were the working class, while the subclass was living on the hills. So there again, the correlation between inequality and the victims of climate change is nearly perfect. It's despairing, but it's nearly perfect. And finally, there's an equality of access to environmental goods. Who has access to organic food, to good mobility, to a good isolated building and houses, to nature and so on? It's always the most privileged social groups. And who is the victim of the absence of trees in the environment, of parks, of not good isolated house and so on and so forth? It's always the poorest part of the people, and always the women more than the men, and always the racialized population more than the non-racialized, or call it as you want, other groups. So inequality is everywhere in the climate change phenomenon. And Bruno Latour, who recently passed away, in one of his last interviews said, he was certainly not a socialist, but he said in his last interview, well, in the end, climate change is the new class struggle. So yes, climate change is the new class struggle. So that's the first point. We have the best diagnosis. We social democrats, with all the instruments created by those beautiful economists, sociologists, and so on, who have analyzed the phenomenon of inequalities and how social inequalities, economic inequalities, climate inequalities, gender and racial inequalities are very deeply correlated. We have the perfect analysis to demonstrate that if you do not fight inequalities, you will never be in a position to curb climate change. Second, I think we have the best policy options. Of course, we have to renovate them. We have to constantly try and demonstrate that they work better than the alternative. But I remember, again, when I was a young minister in charge of climate, all those discourses at the European level, the European Commission, European Council, but also in the global conferences of the UNFCCC, they were telling us two instruments which solve all issues. One is liberalization. Let's liberalize energy markets, and that will be perfect. With the liberalization of energy markets, we will have more competition, more investments, a natural shift towards renewable energy, and so on and so forth, with stable price. And we, in fact, had exactly the contrary. No investments, no shift towards renewable, and very high volatility of prices. The other instrument was cap and trade. Let's cap and trade. We need a deep technological transformation of the industries, but well, that's very simple. Let's put a cap, and then let's leave the companies exchange their quotas, and we will have a market, and the market will solve everything. And there again, all analyses have demonstrated that it hasn't worked at all. So do we have other options? Yes, we have other options. Very, very classic instruments of public policy that we implemented in the 1930s, that we implemented again in the post-war period, 1950s, 1960s, and that we still need today. And we can, of course, we need to modernize them. Of course, we not simply copy what we did in those periods, but yes, we need some kind of planification. And this is what we are doing with the Green Deal in the EU, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. Not sort of a Soviet-style planification, not a Chinese-style planification, but yes, when we use norms and standards, when we use subsidies to big companies, when we support R&D and that kind of things, all that kind of instruments that Mariano Mazzucato has been advocated, for example, for the last 15 years. Well, we are organizing some kind of planification, and it works better than a pure market liberalization. Second, we will need public services, because if we want to provide a good quality of life to all the citizens, good housing, good public parks, good transportation, and so on and so forth, public services will always be much more parsimonious with natural resource and energy than individual solutions. A tram or a bus is always much more parsimonious than 100 electric cars. Social housing is much more parsimonious than lots of isolated houses, and a public canteen in a school is the best manner to avoid waste of food. So yes, we need those classic instruments of the social democratic vision, and we need to restore them and to demonstrate that they have a role to play. 3, we need public investments, of course, not just in those public services, but also to help the companies organize their own transition. 4, we will need social policies. We know that this great transformation will destroy millions of jobs all around the world, that the decarbonization of the economy has been demonstrated by reports of the ILO, of the OECD. It will destroy billions of jobs. It will also create millions of jobs, but the jobs that will be destroyed and the jobs that will be created would not be the same. And so if we don't have a strong social policy, if we don't have something like a job guarantee and the strongest role for the public authority in the organization of the so-called labor market, it will never work. We need regulation of the labor market there again. And finally, this will cost an awful lot of money. Yes, we will need at least, according to estimation, at least 2% GDP investments each year for the next 25 years, at least, which means that we have to find that money. And to find that money, we need a strong fiscal agenda. And if workers already pay too many taxes and they have not been enriched the last 20 years, we've seen that in Branko's presentation, the only one who can pay are the ones who have a lot of money, so the multinationals and the millionaires. So simple as that. And 3, I think we can also argue that we have the best methods to implement these policies. I'll be very short here again, but if we want to succeed in this transition, we will need something like Sandrine mentioned it yesterday, that the first socialism was in wide extent a local socialism, a municipal socialism. If you think of social housing today, if you think of transportation, if you think of access to food in the schools, in public parks and all those things, those are by definition local investments that need to be organized. So it's a good way to restore and to rejuvenate the local socialism and cooperative action and that kind of methods that were so popular at the beginning of the 20th century. And that proved so efficient that we still need today. Second, at the national level, if you want to make planification, you will need much more dialogue and social dialogue with the trade unions, like in the years of the New Deal, like in the post-war period, with some kind of neo-corporatist, as it was called, coordination between the government and the social partners. At the micro level, in the companies themselves, if we want to open the discussion on what do we need to produce and how can we produce it, how do we need to produce it, we need to go back to the struggle for the democratization of the companies and more power for the trade unions and more power for the workers within the companies themselves. And finally, at the global level, what we need is a multilateral framework, inclusive, transparent, building bridges between rich and poor countries. But by chance, this already exists. This is UNFCCC, which is very often criticized. But for having participating in these meetings for more than 10 years, I can tell you it's much more powerful than what people think, and it's much more useful than what people think. So we should simply strengthen this framework. Now, my fourth and last question. We can say, well, we social democrats, we're the best. We have the best analysis. We have the best policy options. We have the best institutional setting and methods. But a last thing needs to be done. We need to convince the people. We need to win the election. So simple as that. And that's not so simple. As a politician, I can tell you. So you can say, well, this is a kind of fiscal policy that you need, and so on and so forth. But how do you manage to convince people that yes, this is an option? The only way to give some elements of answer to this big strategic question is to look at the past, to look at the past experiences, see what we can draw from the past. But if we take Polanyi first, we all know the lesson of the great transformation. In moments of great transformation, when everything changes very rapidly, the intellectual and ideological context, the technologies, the right of properties, the social relationships, and so on. What do people ask for? Protection. There's a deep quest for protection in times of deep change. But what Polanyi also shows is that the grand transformation is also a great bifurcation. There are two possible ways, two historical ways of protection. You can have a social and democratic protection, as we had with Roosevelt and the New Deal and with the social democratic compromise in 1950s and 1960s. But you can also have an authoritarian and nationalistic kind of protection. And I'm sorry to say that if I'm looking at Europe, and at least the part of the world that I know best, well, the combination that we have today in Europe shows that, unfortunately, this option, this kind of protection is becoming very powerful everywhere in Europe, because they mix a fear of change, the middle class fear of change. I mean, if you say climate transition will mean that you will have to buy a smaller car, that you will have to eat less burgers, that you will have to travel less often, that you will have to move to a smaller house and so on, well, it's not really, I mean, it's not really attractive as a prospect, and, especially for the middle class. If you add to that a fear of migration and saying, you know, with climate change, there will be lots of climate migrants and more migrants than today. And then you can say, well, the answer is simple. We have technology on the one hand. Technology would solve everything. It's a strange mix of passé and future-oriented prospect and a strong leadership. And with this, we will protect you in an authoritarian way. So how can we, progressive, build a vision and build a narrative that can counter this prospect? Well, it's if I had to answer, I would be a politician and a very successful one. But just some elements. First, I think let us not forget that not everybody fears change, because this is the dominant discourse. Many people want change. At least 25–30% of the population in the rich countries want change. They want better houses. They want better neighborhoods. They want better public transportation. They want better schools. They want better access to health, and so on and so forth. So it's not true that people just want stability. A large part of the public want change and want another society. So this ethos of change, this ethos of progress is something that can be mobilized. And if we manage to say, you know, climate transition will not just be about limitation. Climate transition will also be about improving your housing, improving your public transportation, improving the quality of the air and the quality of the environment, and so on and so forth. We can open a new Keynesian agenda for the next generation that can help build a majority, or at least coalesce a number of social groups who have an interest in improving their own conditions. Second, in politics, you always need polarization. If you want to build a coalition of social groups, and I'm convinced that objectively, the winners of a transition, there would be much more winners than losers of a transition organized in a fair manner. But you have to convince those people, yes, that they have shared interests. That's always been the dilemma of the left. How do you convince people who pertain to different social groups that they have something in common? And there you need polarization. And that's why the fiscal agenda is so important. That's why we have to say, we have to tax this one person. We have to tax those multinationals. So you need to give a very simple vision of the world to improve the situation of at least 50% of the population, including in the rich countries. You have to ask the richest part of the people to pay. And as we see that they're doing really well and the rest of the population is suffering, there is fairness in this prospect. And finally, and I conclude here, we on the left should not forget that what made socialism or social democracy, whatever you want, so powerful was also the fact that at the beginning of the 20th century, in the 1930s, 1950s and 60s, each time it was very powerful. Those social movements were also aware that they needed an ethic. They needed to be a morality. They needed to have a vision of society which was different from the dominant vision of society. If we keep saying that consumption is everything, that yes, we need growth, that yes, it's only with material growth that we will give people what they want, and we do not manage to reconstruct an independent morality, an independent vision of the world that can go into contradiction with the capitalist vision of the world, we never manage. So yes, we need to restore the values of decency, of fairness, of self-limitation, those kind of values that have been so important in the Western tradition from the Greek philosophy to nowadays. It's not probably not enough to win the elections, but at least it was possible in the past. So if it was possible in the past, there's no reason why it's not possible today. And it is, in any case, the only manner to stay true to the values and ideals of socialism. Thank you for your attention.